several major Republican figures in the last couple of months. We want more babies, and therefore IVF is good.
Having compassion and expressing sympathy and the heart, understanding the emotions involved. The other angle of this, which is we still need to have an academic, intellectual conversation in pursuit of truth, because the truth is what sets us free.
Welcome back to the Bridgehead. Today I'm going to be having a great discussion with Stephanie Gray Connors, who is a pro-life debater, a pro-life author, a pro-life speaker. She was the co-founder of the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform, the organization I still serve as communications director, and then she left that job to pursue speaking and writing. She has spoken at Google Talks. She has debated former abortionists, and she's written a number of great books. And one of those books is Conceived by Science, Thinking Carefully and Compassionately About Infertility and IVF. We're having this discussion for two reasons. The first reason is that the Republican Party has endorsed in vitro fertilization as it moves away from its pro-life stance, and we wanted to discuss why the Republican Party was wrong on that. Secondarily, however, we also wanted to answer people's tough questions about IVF, recognizing that not all pro-life people are aware of all the truth surrounding IVF, and some people might struggle with certain aspects of that. Stephanie Gray Connors, again, her book is phenomenal, and so we thought she was the right person for this interview. And so the first part of the podcast will take a look at IVF as a political and ethical issue in the context of what's going on right now in politics. And the second part of this interview will be answering tough questions about IVF that many of you might have. Here's our conversation. Well, Steph, to start off, talking about your book, Conceived by Science, which you and I have discussed before, the organization CCBR, which you founded and I still work for, sells it. I think we just ordered another 500 copies. And I think one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this book with you is because IVF is actually oddly in the news almost all the time now. President Donald Trump refers to the fact that he supports it, although during the presidential debate, he referred to it in kind of confusing terms. And the GOP has announced that they support IVF. Senator Ted Cruz has come out putting forward a bill on IVF. So I wanted to start off just by asking your response to all that.
Yeah, I'm incredibly troubled by people who have claimed belief in preborn children's right to life to varying degrees, and yet at the same time supporting IVF, because the reality is in vitro fertilization not only dehumanizes preborn children, but threatens their lives, endangers their lives, and in the case of many preborn children, actually ends their lives, all in an effort to, yes, indeed, create some lives and bring some babies to term. So if we care about preborn life, we have to care about all things which are a threat to preborn life, not just abortion.
So what do you make of the fact that you have some of these politicians presumably do know better, because the same science that makes you be anti-abortion would presumably lead you to oppose IVF. And obviously you've been a pro-life apologist for many, many years. IVF is a subject that you've examined in book length for more recently. Do you have any insights as to why people who can be so good on the abortion issue can simultaneously be so bad on the IVF issue, and we're dealing with the same set of facts in many ways?
I think there's confusion because there's ignorance. And I don't mean that in a demeaning way, but people literally just don't know. Ignorance is not knowing. And there's a lot of confusion around the nitty-gritty, the specifics of in vitro fertilization. And people think it's so radically different from abortion because with abortion, they're saying, hey, someone doesn't want to be pregnant, a child already exists, now you're ending a child's life. That's obviously wrong if you believe in preborn children's right to life. In the case of IVF, they would say that's a response to infertility where there is no child, where someone cannot conceive a child and their whole heart and soul is ordered to desiring a child. Then in vitro fertilization is, in their minds, ordered to creating that child. And they think to themselves, what could possibly be wrong with that? If we are for life, then wouldn't we be for the creating of life? But what they are not either understanding or admitting or being aware of is the fact that IVF involves, as I mentioned, ending some lives in order to create others, endangering preborn life and so forth. And again, we can unpack that, but I think that's why there's confusion. People don't think it ends life. They don't think it threatens life. They think it's just about celebrating life.
So let's get the encapsulation and then dig into a bunch of the specifics. Let's say Senator Ted Cruz is sponsoring legislation to support IVF. He's again a long-term pro-life Republican senator, and you had 5 minutes on the phone with him, and you got to explain to him why this is a bad idea from a pro-life perspective. How would you do it?
I would ask for his short answer for why he rejects abortion. And then, assumedly, he's going to say, because the preborn child is a human being with a right to life. And I would say, when does that human being begin his or her life according to science? And he, being pro life, would say the moment of fertilization. So then I would say, when it comes to in vitro fertilization, where is fertilization happening? The life that you say begins at fertilization in the mother's body normally, in vitro fertilization comes into existence in a lab. Okay, once that life comes into existence, then I would say, what happens to that life? Well, he might say, well, that life gets inserted in the woman's body, hopefully implants and grows for 9 months. So then I would say, okay, how many lives are created for that insertion to happen? Usually 5, 10, 15, 20, possibly more eggs are harvested and fertilized, which means you could get 5, 10, 15, or 20 human beings who are now in existence by your admission, life begins at fertilization, are in existence in a lab. So then I would say to him, on that basis, you're not going to insert 5, 10, 15, or 20 human beings in a woman's body at once. So what is going to happen to, let's say, 19 out of 20 of those human beings right out of the gate, or 18 out of 20 of those human beings? Even if 1 or 2 are inserted right away, or within, 24 to 48 hours or a few days, the reality is the vast majority, if not all, first of all, will be subjected to genetic testing and fitness. And if they're not deemed, genetically, adequate or viable, then they won't even be considered usable. Then they'll be subjected to the freezer. They might never be thawed. That's an injustice. If they are thawed, are their lives endangered in the freezing process, in the thawing process? So what about those lives, then I would say? What about the babies that are discarded or because they're used for medical research and then ultimately killed? If we care about human life, how do you justify that with the pro-life views that you have proposed?
No, that's fantastic, because I do think that a lot of pro-life people are open to it. It needs to be approached very sensitively, because obviously almost everybody at this point knows somebody who's conceived through IVF. And as you point out in your book, one of the difficulties with approaching this issue is that people may misinterpret your ethical opposition to IVF as saying, your brother, your cousin, your friend shouldn't exist, which is not actually what you're saying. You're making an ethical argument. And so before we get into the details of that, I wanted to ask you, because I didn't actually ask you this last time we talked about your book, what made you decide to dedicate an entire book to the issue of IVF? You've written books on both abortion and euthanasia, but that's been more your wheelhouse for a couple of decades. This issue obviously relates to ethics at the beginning of life, but it's a different subject. And your book, like, we distribute it all the time. It is, I think, the best resource on this issue. It's an unfortunately sparse field, but your book is fantastic for both Catholics and for Protestants. The argument is very clear. It's very compelling and very compassionate. So what made you choose to actually commit the time to writing a whole book just on that subject?
Yeah, great question. I would say, interestingly, for those who think there's no connection between abortion and IVF, the very reason I wrote the book was because as I was speaking on abortion, the topic of IVF kept coming up. On the part of my audience members. And so during Q&A, audience members would say, well, if this is your view on abortion, what's your view on IVF? It's almost like they knew there's got to be some sort of connection here. Because if this woman is making the claim that science says life begins at fertilization, then what does that mean for all these lives that have begun at fertilization that are now in freezers and so forth? And so I was being asked, what do I think about IVF? What do I think about people conceived that way? Knowing that, as you pointed out statistically at this time in the world now, many of my audience members, that could have been their story, or the story of their sibling, or the story of a relative. And so I started to realize this was hitting people very personally. And it was an area where people were asking me questions because they didn't know how to think through it. They didn't know how to respond to others' questions from an apologetic or argument perspective, kind of intellectually discussing the issue, because there was so much emotion often in the conversation, and they wanted to know how to handle that. And so I sensed, okay, there's a lack of formation, and I want to provide formation in this area where I see a great need. And there was also this realization, which again, we'll talk about the people who struggle with infertility and the weight of that. But the point I wanted to make is that if we think the weight of abortion is so heavy because it involves taking, let's say, one or two lives, if a woman has had one or maybe a repeat abortion, two abortions, and she's got to come to terms with, wow, I ended the life of two children. If we're concerned about that, it gets even weightier when we're talking about IVF, because if someone has, let's say, had 20 children created in a lab, only ever had 2 to 5 inserted, and maybe one has come to term, let's say 5 were inserted, that's 15 children that are dead as a result of an effort to do IVF. 15 is way more than 2 who have lost their lives through abortion. That's 15 that have lost their lives through IVF. That is an incredibly heavy reality to come to terms with. So I thought there is a need to talk about this issue and be a voice for these children.
Do you find that the way we deal with the issue of IVF, it's almost kind of a challenge to pro-lifers? Like how much do you actually see embryos and zygotes and blastocysts as persons? Because it's interesting when we're talking about abortion, people are very clear. They know where their line is, a new, unique, living, whole human being at fertilization. And then when we're talking about IVF, the language kind of changes. And a lot of people who would be opposed to abortion readopt very dehumanizing terminology around the issue. And sometimes it almost seems as though even pro-life people find it hard to conceptualize, children, so small we can hardly see them as full human persons, and that this is most revealed by how we deal with the issue of IVF.
Absolutely. The test is of whether we really believe the claims we're making is, are we consistent? And that would come up when I would discuss abortion. Back in the day during debates, people would say, well, if you believe that the one-celled embryo was human, that only within a few weeks, the not yet technically called a fetus, but the embryo preborn child, if you believe that's a human, then you would believe in having funerals for miscarriages. And I remember always saying to my debate opponents who would bring this up, or audience members, I would say, well, actually, I do believe in having funerals for children lost through miscarriage. At the time, I hadn't had any of my own children. I have 4 children that I have lost to miscarriage. 2 are alive. And so I've had 4 funerals. So yes, I'm very consistent because I believe the early preborn child is a human, not because I have a religious view that tells me that per se, but because science has established that life begins at fertilization. Religion tells me we ought to treat human life kindly. But science tells me when life begins. Because of that, I'm very consistent. But when it comes to IVF, yes, we see an inconsistency. People will use dehumanizing language. They'll also use confusing or will be confused, I should say, about the terminology they use. They'll often say, oh, we have some eggs frozen. Now, technically, some people can freeze their eggs, but all too often when people reference their eggs being frozen, it's actually their embryos that are frozen. And there's a big difference. Eggs are a part of a human, a part of a woman, but an embryo is a whole human offspring of the parents. So when people talk about, eggs being frozen very flippantly, when in fact it's children being frozen, that's one example of vagueness, confusion, and a lack of accuracy.
Do you find it interesting how quickly abortion activists understood where pro-life arguments would lead after Dobbs? It was weeks before they were saying they're going to come for fertility treatments, they're going to come for IVF. Like they knew almost right away that if we were going to move towards a more pro-life society that treated the preborn as human persons, then this didn't just apply to abortion.
Right. I mean, in a sense, yeah, it's a great point. Like they're willing to admit what even many on our own side won't admit. And that's typically because they, on the other side, have an agenda of they just want, reproductive freedom, as they call it, very broadly speaking. And so they fear anything which is a threat to their personal choices and things that they desire and want. But yeah, they can connect the dots. They can see it. And then our side thinks, oh, I'm going to sound terrible if I say I'm against IVF. So I'll say I'm in favor of IVF, or at least under certain circumstances or done certain ways. And it's a reaction of our side showing themselves to be not always thinking so deeply, but instead just having the emotional reaction of, I don't want to look bad. I don't want to seem insensitive. So I'm going to hold this position.
So how would we begin to approach this issue? Let's say we're giving a presentation at a church like you did, and it's a pro-life presentation, which both you and I do many of those. And somebody asks about IVF, and the person who's asking, you suspect that they've either done IVF or somebody very close to them has. You can always tell by the emotionally charged manner in which a question is asked, or maybe a sort of a tremor in their voice, that this issue is deeply personal to them. How do you begin to present some very, for her, difficult ethical truths in a way that she will receive them and also shows compassion for whatever she has gone through on that journey?
Yes, I'm glad you asked. I mean, certainly in that context, right out of the gate, I would come out a little differently than how we came out of the gate. I mean, we're just diving right into this topic. It makes sense. You and I are having an intellectual discussion. We're presenting it to the general public. But if I'm being asked by someone who likely has been down that path or struggled with infertility or conceived that way, yeah, my first response to the question is going to acknowledge two things. The first thing is to acknowledge the very heavy cross of infertility, of not being able to have the desire for a child fulfilled, because that desire is good, it is ordered, it is godly, it is within our nature as human beings to want offspring. So to acknowledge that an unfulfilled desire like that is a very heavy cross, a deep sorrow for someone to live with. The second point that I would want to make is that anyone who has already gone down the path of IVF, and therefore anyone conceived as a result of that way, is still valuable, is still made in God's image, and is equal to someone who was conceived, you could say, naturally through sexual intimacy. That any moral critique of IVF should not be perceived as a criticism of the existence of another person's life, or the dignity, I should say, of that other person. I call into question the morality of how someone has come to be, but not the value of who has come into be. So anyone conceived by IVF, just like someone could be conceived on a one-night stand, that goes against my views. I believe that children should be conceived through sexual intimacy within the confines of marriage. So therefore, someone conceived as a result of a hookup has not come into existence in a moral way, but they themselves still have dignity, value. They're unrepeatable, irreplaceable, made in God's image. And so the same is true if I'm providing a moral critique of IVF. The person conceived by IVF is still unrepeatable, irreplaceable, made in God's image. And then for those who struggle with infertility, I would acknowledge different friends. And I shared some interviews in my book that I had of various friends of mine who have walked that journey. Some ultimately succeeded in conceiving naturally. Others pursued fostering, adoption, or a type of spiritual parenthood. In my own experience, I to describe myself as infertile would be inaccurate. I started having children when I was 40, which is a more difficult time to get pregnant. In my case, I actually can get pregnant very easily, but my body cannot seem to sustain pregnancies very well. So the vast majority of my children have died through miscarriage. So although I don't know what it's like to not conceive readily, I do know what it's like to not be able to hold in your arms a baby you so desperately want. I do know what it's like to grieve the loss of a child, to never hold 4 out of 6 of my children. And in that regard, there are no words to describe the emotional turmoil that one can go through, let alone the physical turmoil of a loss like that.
And that's one of the things that makes, I find this issue not more difficult to explain ethically, philosophically, even religiously. But when it comes to talking about abortion, when we're talking heart apologetics, right? When we're talking to, as you have, you talk to a young man whose mother had an abortion, and you're trying to convey to him that this isn't about condemning his mother, but the action. I find that easier to do than to talk to people inside the Christian church who have done IVF or accept IVF. I'm not sure why I feel that way. I've made the argument. I've interviewed you several times. I reviewed your book in print, so I've been pretty public with my position, which I hope most people would assume that I hold. But it's still, even though abortion in some ways is most people find abortion more difficult to talk about, but I think that IVF, for many Christians, they don't know how to bring it up. And I've been asked this a bunch of times, and so I wanted to ask you, how would you bring that subject up in the context of your church when you know people are doing it, and you feel a responsibility to speak out because you do know that IVF does, unfortunately, sadly, tragically result in many preborn babies dying?
Hmm. So, a couple ways. Certainly, appealing to our church leadership. I mean, we have to realize that, the priests, pastors, or whatever one's denomination, they are the ones that have the pulpit every Sunday, and they have the power to, reach large numbers of people who maybe won't come on a Tuesday night or a Thursday morning to a meeting, but they will show up on a Sunday. And so, what are our pastors going to preach on a Sunday? So, appealing to our spiritual leadership to speak out from the pulpit on a Sunday to that crowd that has gathered on this topic, and to do so sensitively, which means acknowledge the struggle of infertility, provide alternatives, which again we can get to, alternatives to IVF, talk about the dignity of all persons regardless of how we were conceived, but really convey a message about the gravity of this issue. Again, because it's in the news, it's even making its way, as you said, like into the presidential debate. People are talking now about IVF at a national level politically. Then we need to be speaking in our churches about it. And for those who aren't the pastors, I think we in our own church communities could start programs where we have, there used to be, or there still is, post-abortion Bible studies. Well, what about a Bible study addressing the issue of infertility and pursuit of IVF? Grief programs to acknowledge the sin of having ended many children's lives in order to create a child, and naming those children, going through a whole program of repentance, healing, acknowledgement of what went on, and developing something for one's church within one's denomination that speaks the language of its own faith community, is something I think a layperson could do. And we don't just have to rely on our spiritual leadership to do that, but we certainly can be the people that equip our pastors to do a better job preaching from the pulpit.
So let's zoom out for just a minute. You do a great job describing this in your book, and you mentioned this earlier in our conversation already, is that when you hear Republicans, when you hear, that's the way Trump put it in his debate. He called it IVF fertilization. We are very pro IVF fertilization. And most people, he just sort of assumes this is a fertility treatment, but most people have no idea what the IVF industry does, and that the number of moral conundrums it's created and what has actually happened since we accepted IVF as a so-called fertility treatment. So maybe give our viewers and listeners just sort of a glimpse. What has it done to our society? What has been the result of permitting, accepting, and promoting IVF?
Yeah. So, well, starting with how it began, I mean, it still occurs as it began, which is sperm is collected, eggs are retrieved, and a scientist puts the two together in glass, in vitro, hence the name in vitro fertilization, in a lab, and then fertilization occurs. And then a short time after, some of those embryos are then inserted into a woman's body. We say often, oh, they're implanted. Well, they're not. We wait to see if they implant. So they're inserted into her body. If they implant, then we see, will it be a successful pregnancy that goes to birth? And then, you have your live birth. So that is how it began. And now we have a situation where when it comes to, first of all, collecting sperm, typically that's done as an act of masturbation. Generally, in the broadly Christian community, people would object to that and say, no, we should not be sexually aroused on our own. We should be in a context of a communal sexual relationship with our spouse. So right out of the gate, now we have an issue where we are collecting sperm in an unethical way. Some people might say, well, there is a method you can use where you use a non-toxic condom, have sex with your spouse, but the condom collects the semen so that you can bring it to the lab for IVF to occur in the lab. The objection there is that now, instead of giving your seed to your spouse, you are taking it off to a stranger, and the child will then come into existence not beneath the mother's heart, but instead at the hands of a stranger in the lab. Then what can happen? Well, we are humans, and the moment you start manufacturing a human, the way we manufacture objects, but humans are subjects and not objects, so we shouldn't be manufactured. you introduce natural human error that can occur. So, one of the things that has happened is embryos that were created in the lab have been inserted in the wrong woman's body because there's just human error. They get the number wrong of the patient. And so, patient A's embryo gets inserted into patient F's body. So then it's not until birth or sometime afterwards when there was a case where a Caucasian couple noticed, a few months or a year after birth, their baby started to exhibit Asian features. And they went back to their IVF clinic and found that the wrong child had been inserted into the mother's body. And then there was a lawsuit. So you have those types of things. But it gets even messier. You have situations where you have babies created that aren't even from a couple who were in relationship together. So you can have a woman donate or sell her eggs, a man donate or sell his sperm. They don't even know each other, and their gametes are used to create offspring that then come to term in a woman who wants the child or a surrogate who. So now we are like farming off the gestation of our children to strangers in a transactional type relationship where women are paid tens of thousands of dollars to gestate a baby for someone else. You have women in poor countries then who are preyed upon because they're desperate for money. And so rich, Western couples will go to poorer countries like India and say, hey, gestate our baby for us and we'll pay you, which is a handsome sum for those people, but way cheaper than if the couple had used a surrogate or an egg seller or egg donor in their own country. And then, so you've got the buying and selling of human beings. You have couples that create embryos, plan to have them all implanted and then or inserted, and then they divorce. So then their embryos are in limbo in a freezer, and they're like, well, I don't want them anymore. Well, I do, but the man is the one who wants them, and he doesn't have a woman to put them into because he's no longer. I mean, it gets messier and messier all the time. There's lots we could go on to. I'll let you ask a question, but one other example that pops into mind is then you can have a couple who desperately want a baby. They have a baby inserted, and then a few weeks into the pregnancy, or maybe the first trimester is nearing its end, they do basic genetic testing that is typical in a pregnancy, and they discover the child has Down syndrome, and they're like, wow, we wanted a baby, but we didn't want a Down syndrome baby. So then the very child that was so desperately wanted, tens of thousands of dollars put down to create that child, now result in the child not coming to birth because the parents opt for an abortion. And now you have IVF conceived children that are aborted because they're not quite right, which makes sense. Because in the world of manufacturing, in the world of having commodification, you pay and you receive. And if something isn't what you were expecting, you expect your money back. You expect a replacement that's up to par. And if we treat humans like commodities, then we are going to naturally want the bad ones, the less than perfect ones set aside so we can get the replacement.
Yeah, there's something called a +1, -1 pregnancy too. When IVF works and suddenly they find themselves with triplets or twins, and they're like, we didn't want that many, so we want to get one aborted. And do you know the conservative influencer Dave Rubin?
Yes.
Like Lila Rose has
Yeah.
talked about abortion before. And he recently had children via surrogate, but the surrogates had to sign a contract saying if the baby turned out to be disabled, that she would get an abortion.
Wow, I didn't know that. I know that is common. In fact, I know surrogates can be paid. One clinic I read they can be paid up to $10,000 to have an abortion if the couple changes their mind. I didn't know Dave had that in his contract. I was really troubled when I saw that. I mean, in a sense, not totally surprised given that Dave's conservative in some issues, but not others. But I remember when all that happened, I thought, I just want to talk to him. I want to debate him. I want to be able to explain, like, this is not how we ought to treat human beings. Particularly the youngest of our kind who are the most vulnerable and can't defend themselves.
So that's the biggest case. And so what you just described is something that I think that politicians, when they're thinking about IVF, should really consider it, because they're supposed to look at the social implications of legislation that they're creating. And the things that you're saying, they don't seem to be aware of them at all, or if they are, they're so determined to kind of buy some brownie points to distract people from their anti-abortion position by saying, hey, but we really do love women because look what we're doing over here, that they're willing to kind of sacrifice it. Let's go all the way to the other end of the spectrum for a moment, because here's what you'll get some people saying in response. I agree with you on everything. So what if, to avoid all of those very like troubling ethical quandaries, we do one sperm, one egg, and we never freeze. We create one embryo and then we implant the embryo right away. And so we avoid the potential for it dying during the freezing or the thawing process. We're not making a whole bunch. If it splits into twins, we can keep them both. Is there any ethical way to do IVF?
Yeah, great question. So the short answer is no. But to elaborate on that, I would say the fact that what you've just described is better than how IVF is generally done. And I would agree that is way better than how it's generally done. Doesn't mean it's still, or it doesn't mean that it's right. In the same way, if we're talking about 2 + 2 = 4, and someone says 2 + 2 is 5 and someone else says 2 + 2 is 10, well, the answer 5 and the answer 10 are both wrong, but technically 5's closer than 4, but it's still wrong. And so I would say what you've just presented is an improvement, but there's two problems. First, there's still the risk of human error, because even if you're creating one embryo, that embryo is out of the woman's body, it's in a lab, and is that embryo going to be inserted in the right mother's body? Is the sperm sample the right father's sperm sample, or is it someone else's? There still is a risk that someone could be created and or inserted in the body of what should be the genetic mother, who would never be able to come into existence, morally speaking, in the marriage bed. And by that, I mean, is not the offspring of the mother and father, or is not in the biological mother's body because of human error, because we have turned the creation of life into something that gets manufactured, which then is my second point. And I think to address this issue that, okay, well, if we narrow the parameters, is it ethical? At the end of the day, we don't have a right to another human being. We can desire children, just as in my book I talk about we can desire spouses. That's good, that's normal, that's ordered. But the desire for a spouse does not give someone the right to engage in human trafficking. And in my book, I talk about how that's a major problem in China, where the male-female imbalance, due to decades of preference for male children, and therefore more men than women in China, has resulted in men who can't find wives, who are now going to other countries or within their own country engaging in trafficking in order to fulfill the desire for a wife. Desire for a wife, good. Human trafficking, bad. So in the same way, the desire for a child, good, but fulfilling that desire, for example, by kidnapping, would be bad. And I would say fulfilling the desire for a child also by manufacturing is also bad. And the reality is, if a child is conceived by science and not by sex, they are being manufactured. The parents may love each other, but at the end of the day, the child is not coming into existence as a fruit of the physical expression of the permanence of their marital love and their marriage vows to be faithful and fruitful and freely give each other to the other for life. That instead of the child coming through sex, which is a physical manifestation of that, the child is being forced into existence at the hands of a stranger, often even determined by the stranger. There's a type of procedure within IVF called ICSI, where instead of just putting a sperm sample in with the eggs that are harvested, one sperm is chosen. The parents aren't choosing that one sperm. How would they determine that? So it's the scientist determining the one sperm, injecting that into the egg. They are the determiners of who one's child will be, as opposed to a couple engaging in sexual intimacy, prayerfully saying, Lord, thy will be done. We hope this bears fruit through offspring, but we have no guarantee what sperm hit what egg, if sperm hit any egg at all. If that happens, if the child that is conceived comes to birth, if the child does come to birth, if the child lives a long life or a short life, we have no control over those things. And as human beings, we shouldn't, because we are creature and not creator. And so there has to be an element of, sure, we can know our bodies and we can know our fertility and we can find signs of infertility and try to correct that. But when it comes to creating human beings, we should be begotten, not made. We should be the fruit of an expression of love, not the manufacture of parts by a stranger in a lab. Essentially, we aren't meant to contract out the receiving of life made in God's image, who are offspring with the person we love. We're not meant to contract that out to a third party external to someone, external to our marital relationship.
So I think I know what you're going to say, but there are going to be some people who hear all of that and say, I understand the ick factor. I agree with much of what you're saying, but why is it wrong to manufacture a baby if we agree on it and we really, really want one?
Well, because we have to ask, is the baby a human being? And if the baby's a human being, can we ever possess or claim a right to another? Which gets back to kind of what I was saying about desiring a spouse. We could ask ourselves, and this is a question I ask in my book, why is slavery wrong? It's wrong because one person is claiming to possess another. And by possessing another, instead of having a relationship of equals, they're creating a situation where there is someone who's inferior and someone who's superior. And the moment we say, I don't really like the sounds of it, it doesn't sit totally right with me, but I want a baby so badly, if I try to do it as ethically as possible, isn't that okay? At the end of the day, we're creating a situation where we are, in a sense, possessing another, claiming a right to another, manufacturing another. And who are we to do that to someone who is a subject and not an object? In any other area, we ought not jeopardize the lives of another, manufacture another, treat another as an object. And the whole IVF industry does that.
I'll give you one final argument that I've actually heard before, because I know how I responded to it, but I'm interested to know how you would respond to it. They would say, well, only God can actually really create a human being, because a human being has a soul. If it doesn't have a soul, it's not a human being. And as such, if a human being is created by these scientific strangers, then obviously God is using them to bring about that human being. And so God is still involved in the process. He has to be, because otherwise we wouldn't have a human being. You and I would both agree with that. And so therefore, we're just using this means that technology has provided to us to solve the pain of infertility.
Great question. I think the best answer to it is an analogy, and say, okay, if you're simply saying, to distill everything you said down to the point, if you're simply saying, because God gives a soul, and we're talking about the new creation of a human being who has a soul from God, if that happens, clearly God is somehow endorsing, facilitating, making it happen, then would we say that about rape? Because your friend and mine, Ryan Baumberger, an amazing pro-life speaker in the movement, was conceived as a result of rape. Ryan loves his life, is so grateful for his birth mom for continuing his life, and for his adoptive parents, caring for him after birth. And as much as he loves his life, he would never say the way he came to be was good. Ryan knows rape is a terrible evil, and that God hates rape, that God considers it a vile sin that goes against his commands. Would we say then the fact that Ryan came into existence and he has a soul, that somehow God endorsed the rape? No, we wouldn't say that. We would just say this: God, in his majesty and glory, can take even human sin and draw good out of it. It doesn't make the sin good. It makes God amazing, because he can draw good from evil while not endorsing the evil. And so the fact that a soul enters into an embryo conceived by rape, or a soul comes into an embryo conceived by a hookup, or a soul comes into an embryo conceived through marital sexual intimacy, in all three cases, God has indwelt a soul in each of those human beings, but each of those methods is not equal to the others. One is very good and the other two are not. And so the same could be said by way of using technology, that who has come to be, God has drawn good out of that evil act by bringing a soul into this situation, but it doesn't follow that he endorses the act.
No, that's a fantastic answer. And here's another one that's a bit tough, but it's kind of a bit of a different tack. Is that one of the reasons a lot of people who are strongly opposed to IVF don't bring it up and don't know how to, is because if they have children, they feel like they don't have a right to tell somebody who struggles with infertility, that they can't kind of grab what might look to them to be like a life raft out of this sort of sea of despair that they feel like they're drowning in. And I know that there's a lot of pastors who don't address this issue for that reason, that they simply do not know how they can look a suffering couple in the face and take away their last chance. That's how they feel. I've been told this before. I'm sure you have too. So what would you say to, especially to a pastor, or say, the head of a women's group, or somebody who has the responsibility to speak truth when confronted with this issue? How would you, how would you encourage this person to recognize it? Say you've got a pastor who's got 7 or 8 kids. He's talking to a couple who has none. These are real scenarios. How is he supposed, or she supposed to navigate this?
Again, it comes back to what we touched on earlier, which is having compassion and expressing sympathy and the heart, understanding the emotions involved. And I think we just need to narrate to whoever we're talking to the other angle of this, which is we still need to have an academic, intellectual conversation in pursuit of truth, because the truth is what sets us free. And Jesus never married, but God himself, who Jesus is, gives us a lot of truths about marriage and how we ought to live. We don't need to necessarily experience something in order to make a claim about it. And we can have, in fact, the very opposite experience and still have a valid claim to make. Certainly what you say is something that's crossed my mind. When I've shared my experiences of miscarriage, I know the comeback for anyone who hears those experiences can say, yeah, but you got at the end of the day 2 living children. And some people only have miscarriages, so there's still that element of, I know, I still have an element of happiness to my story. There's sorrow in my story, but there is profound happiness that I know some people won't get to experience. And so I think the best kind of testimony or witness or messaging we can give in acknowledging that is the people who don't get what I've had, or the pastor who has 7 children has had, but still say IVF isn't right and children ought to be received, not forced into existence. And that's why one of the stories I tell in my book is of a friend. For anonymity's sake, I call her Bethany in my book, but she and her husband have been married for a couple decades, never conceived. Now they're beyond the ability to conceive. And she reflected, she never pursued IVF. They did try to naturally correct the underlying problem of not ovulating adequately, but it didn't work out. And one of the things she had to come to terms with was idols, and how we can turn lots of things into idols. The single person can turn marriage into an idol. The married person can turn having children into an idol. Someone can turn their job into an idol. A musician can turn their music into an idol. The idol is something that we put above God, and that if we don't get X, Y, or Z, then God isn't fair. I'm angry at God. I'm not happy in general because I didn't get that. And we might have to wrestle with the fact that it's possible we might have turned something into an idol. That what we want to do is listen to people who have had a good desire, never had it fulfilled, like my friend Bethany, and can say, as Job did, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That can say God is faithful, that can say God is good, and can talk about how the desire they have for children, while never fully addressed through physical parenthood, nonetheless can be addressed and satisfied in very beautiful ways, like spiritual parenthood, which again, in my interview with Bethany, we elaborate on this in the book. So I think we have to acknowledge it is hard to say you can't necessarily experience what I've been able to experience. But truth is truth, regardless of how it makes someone feel.
And we have a sort of a strange conundrum where, in a culture where the birth rate is collapsing in every Western country, in Canada, right, it just went down again. It's 1.26, which is really devastating. And kids are increasingly frowned upon. I lived in Brussels for a couple of months earlier this year. And let me tell you, taking 3 kids around a city like that, you get a lot of weird stares. And people are like, what, no, you got 3? That's insane. I was told this by a lady on the plane the other day, like, 3 kids is just insane. And I'm like, 3 kids is very small in the community that I'm from. But that's sort of the strange thing is that we're both in the pro-life community, but we both come from very life-affirming communities where kids are almost kind of expected. And I feel like that could even be harder. It could be harder to experience infertility in a community that really praises motherhood and values it the way that it should be valued, that welcomes children the way that they should be welcomed, where you'd feel even more left out and sidelined by not having this experience that everybody else is having. And as a guy, I simply can't access it because there's so many aspects of the maternal experience that just don't translate over to the paternal experience at all, from the amount of time that the mother spends with the child before we ever meet them, to just this, one of the things I always think of is, even when men are dying on the battlefield, they scream for their mothers and not their fathers. It's a different kind of relationship. And so it's different for a guy to talk about. But our communities, I think, can be especially hard with this kind of thing.
Yes, one of the stories I share in my book is of a friend of mine from our community, and she and her husband actually had difficulty conceiving the first child, conceived him, but then also had difficulty. Years went by before they had a second child. It's called secondary infertility. And she said she was always on edge whenever there was big family gatherings or friend gatherings or people she'd run into if she hadn't seen them for a while, because she knows or knew they would look at her one child and think, you should be due to have 2 or 3 by now. Like, why don't you have more? Another friend of mine, it took 6 years before she and her husband were able to have a successful pregnancy. They lost one child to miscarriage. And same thing, people were like, TikTok, like, what's going on? Like, we can, in the community, which embraces life, we can also be insensitive without realizing it. We assume, if someone's not pregnant, they're trying to not get pregnant,
Yeah.
as opposed to, no, they desperately want to be pregnant and they're having a very difficult time.
How would you advocate that when we look at this issue now, and I think that there's such an opportunity to be having this discussion right now. It's giving us the opportunity to have this discussion because we've talked about this issue before, but now, like, President Trump is saying it in his own characteristic way, but he's referring to the issue in like presidential debates. The Republicans are talking about it. The pro-life and pro-family party aren't just saying, no, we don't oppose IVF. They're actively saying we're going to fund it. Like, we're going to pay for it. We're actually going to use American tax dollars to fund this treatment that results in the kind of horror show that you've referenced. And they're doing it because they're saying we want more babies. This was the explicit statement of several major Republican figures in the last couple of months. We want more babies, and therefore IVF is good. Elon Musk, who's had a whole bunch of kids through IVF, same thing. He's saying, this is a great policy. It's a family policy. How can we use the current political situation to start having these challenging ethical discussions that badly needed to be had in every family and every church that considers itself to be pro-life?
Mm-hmm. So I think whenever we hear someone say they support IVF, when they have also expressed their opposition to abortion, then we need to, as you gave me that imaginary scenario earlier, we need to say, well, hold on, let me ask you, why are you against abortion? When does life begin? And use their answers to show how that view they embrace already should cause them to object to IVF. I think the other point we need to make, and it was a word you used, which very naturally one could use when talking about this issue, but technically isn't accurate. You said IVF as a treatment. People think it's treatment.
Yeah.
They think it's treatment for infertility. And in reality, it's overriding infertility. It's just finding another way to create a baby, but not actually treating the cause of infertility, the underlying problem. So I think one of the things we need to do is to say, hey, all you people who support life, who want babies, who grieve with the couples who cannot conceive babies, I want that too. Here's what I support. Here's what I suggest. I suggest that we actually address a couple's underlying cause for infertility. Sometimes we can't do that, but in many cases we actually can. If a woman is PCOS, then it's difficult for eggs to be released when ovulation should occur because there's a hard, leathery surface to her ovary. Well, you can have something called wedge resection surgery. I write in my book about a friend who had this done, where a wedge is cut out and then the skin is stretched over the ovary, thinning it so that when an egg is going to be released, it actually makes its way out, so that when a couple naturally has sex, there's an egg that's now out there for sperm to get to. If a woman has endometriosis, again, it can be difficult to get pregnant, but you can have endometriosis surgery and you have an increased odds of getting pregnant shortly after that surgery. Although some doctors can even do the surgery so well that long time can pass and you can still conceive after endometriosis surgery. In my case, I have low progesterone. If you're low in progesterone, you have an increased risk of miscarriage. So what you do, and you don't just say, oh, you're over 40, oh, you have a high increased rate of miscarriage, you should do IVF. You say, oh my goodness, you're over 40, you have a high increased risk of miscarriage because you have low progesterone typically, and in my case I do. So then you get a prescription for progesterone. You literally take it into your body when you're pregnant, and you have your blood tested and you see whether your levels are going up or going down or what they should be at. And then your doctor changes the dose based on that. If a husband has low sperm count, there are things that you can do. There's surgeries that can be done to increase sperm count. So there are so many things that can be done that address the underlying reason for not getting pregnant through sexual intimacy that IVF bypasses. And here's an important point. IVF is really expensive and makes a lot of money for the people who are in that industry. And a lot of times, the things I've just mentioned are inexpensive. Now, certainly surgery itself has its costs, especially now in the United States where I live, right? If you're going to have endometriosis surgery or PCOS surgery, it's not going to necessarily be cheap. But you're not going to have to go through rounds and rounds like people do when they do IVF. You have surgery and then, all going well, you're going to get pregnant. Progesterone treatment, getting your blood tested, super inexpensive. So there is a motivation for the pharmaceutical industries, for the scientific industry, for the medical industry to want people to do IVF because it is a source of income for them that is very high, especially when you start adding in things like, oh, we can gender select. We can select eye color, which some places are actually doing now. We can do genetic testing. We can do all these things. Well, that comes at a price.
So final question, when you were working on this book and you're spending all this time with the subject, you answered a lot of questions on this issue. What do you think is the toughest aspect of this issue to address?
Two things. I really do think overall the toughest thing to address is what we've talked about, which is the emotions involved. For the person who wants a baby, it's really hard to hear someone say, you can't do it that way. And so just having that sensitivity, being able to distinguish for someone, being critical of a method of achieving one's desire, but not being critical of one's desire. Because as you said, it's kind of easier to talk about why abortion's wrong than why IVF is wrong. And I think it's because abortion is fundamentally disordered. You have a baby and you want to kill your baby. That's not normal. Our culture has normalized that over the last several decades, but it's not normal. When you're pregnant, instinctively, everyone says when they find out, congratulations, because the normal thing is to celebrate life. So it's easier to object to abortion in a sense, because it's disordered to embrace the death of one's child. It's harder to object to IVF because it is ordered to want a child. It is ordered to grieve difficulty having a child, getting pregnant with a child. And so to be critical of a solution to what everyone can agree is a problem. I agree it's a problem if someone can't get pregnant. When at least they're in their fertile years. I mean, there comes a point where it's not wrong for a 60-year-old woman to not be able to get pregnant because her body is past the time where that's normal. But it's normal to want a child, and it's normal to think it's terrible that you can't be able to get pregnant. So I think that is the hardest thing. The second kind of hardest thing I would say is if I'm talking to someone who is not religious.
Right.
So, as you and I discussed, I made some religious references. I talked about how we ought to be begotten, not made. We ought to receive life through sexual intimacy with our spouse from God, not force and manufacture someone into existence. But what if someone doesn't believe in God? What if they're like, I don't consider there to be some sort of sacred, mysterious, special element to sexual intimacy? You should be able to manufacture a human. It's a harder sell with those people, but I think we can still make the case on the basis of you're creating more embryos than are typically implanted. You're genetically selecting the fit versus the unfit. You're using, oh yeah, that was another thing besides the masturbation that can go on to retrieve sperm. Often the porn industry gets involved because the clinics that are like, here, provide your sperm sample, or like, come to this back room where we'll give you our Wi-Fi password. Or if you want the old school way, we have a DVD player with all these DVDs, right? And then you're basically creating the gametes, you're producing sperm, not through sexual intimacy with your spouse, but staring at a nameless person using commodification again, using another human to get something that you want. So again, there's so many elements of this that I think we could appeal even to the non-religious to say, hey, is it fair to kill some humans to make another? Is it fair to jeopardize someone's life in order to make another? Is it fair to use another? Is it fair to manufacture someone? Is it fair to kill someone we wanted really badly because they're not genetically up to the standards we want? So I think it can be done, but yeah, those are the 2 points I'd make.
Where can people get your book?
Conceived by Science is available on Amazon, all Amazon marketplaces. And if people want the exact link, other than searching it on Amazon, just go to my website, loveunleasheslife.com. Loveunleasheslife.com, click on books, and then the link is there.
We'll drop that in the description. And for Canadians, we also distribute Stephanie's book at CCBR.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation. If you want to hear other conversations like it, you can subscribe. You can also find our content wherever you get your podcasts, or you can head over to thebridgehead.ca where we post both written commentary and video. Thanks so much for joining us.